Hello and welcome to a podcast called Carnage, the Rules of Writing War Games. This is a series of conversations between Glenn Ford, a man on one side of the screen, and my name is Mike Hutchinson. Hello. We are talking about a series of cursed problems. We probably talked about one last week, and I dare say we'll talk about one next week. Um, we watched a video some months ago, it might even been a year ago, where a nice other games designer floated the idea of a curse problem being something which in your game you want two things to be true. They seem reasonable to ask, but then when you set about designing your game, you find out that the two things are mutually exclusive, and every time you try and move towards one beautiful design goal, it seems to be moving you further away from another of your design goal. And the curse problem that is quite relevant to miniature games, although it is super relevant to things like Magic the Gathering as well, is the idea that your list building ought to really matter, but also the game should be played and won at the table.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is actually this is a really common and tricky one for miniatures games, because miniature games have such a culture of list building. And a lot of people that come to my games, such as Hobgoblin, say, "Oh, this is nice. There's a lot more like tactical. It matters more what you tactically do at the table."
Hmm.
Um, and with these cursed problems, as we have discussed before, and we will no doubt repeat again, like the problem is that there's two things and you can't have them both, but you can have a bit of both of them. And so exactly what quantity of each you put into your game's design and what specific cocktail you cook up is the exciting thing that, like, over time I have learnt to do as a more nuanced game designer. So should we talk about why and how list building should and could and might matter?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting because, unsurprisingly, probably at this point, I've been in multiple conversations about what it is that defines minis games and what is a minis game and what we mean by a minis game.
Nerd.
And I've come across multiple people who insist that the defining feature of these sorts of games is list building.
Right,
Not,
yeah.
not even just a defining feature, but the defining feature. That if you
Right, because you can look at something like Blood Bowl, or like a grid bait, or like BattleTech, and you can say, well, what is it that this, like, why is this not a role-playing game or a board game? It's like, well, it must just be this like army building thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like, definitely it is a feature that a lot of these games share. For some people, it's like, and I think
But
possibly
now
it's,
you're getting super taxonomical, because there might be that we talk about non-discrete miniatures games, and somebody else might be talking about non-discrete army building games, some of which include miniatures, but some don't.
yeah, no, I mean, yeah, absolutely. And it's like, look, okay, Malifaux is definitely the sort of thing that I mean by whatever it is I'm talking about when I talk about these sorts of games. And
Yeah.
Malifaux doesn't have list building. And if it does have list building, it's because of like specific tournament rules that say, do list building. You gather your forces at the table. You don't sort of have to pre-build a list irrespective of what like happens with.
So for the gentle listener that's not as familiar with Malifaux's, I think that's worth unpicking because it's such an odd example.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah.
You're talking about
So
it casually because we both know what you mean, but unpack that for us.
So, what probably most people mean by list building is a process that happens away from the tabletop, away from the other player, before you know what the scenario is that you're getting, probably weeks or months before you actually start play. Then it is locked in place, the force that you are going to use.
You
And then
arrive at the table with your army list already printed out.
absolutely. In Malifaux, you arrive in theory to play a game having every single miniature
Yeah, you
in
bring
the
your case of miniatures.
every single unit within your faction theoretically available for you to take. You can pick your leader at the
Well,
table.
so actually, I think that the sequence goes: you declare your faction, and so presumably,
Mm.
if you declared one faction, and I was like, "Oh, well, the right models I've got in my case to defeat that would be this other faction," and I was going to play orange, but now I'll play green, and so then I
Yes,
declare green.
theoretically, if you roll up to the table with a small truck full of minis, and you're like, I have every model of every faction, and I have them stored within the
Yep.
old login, and I know that, yes, theoretically. And so, and then once you've announced your faction and you're aware of what the schemes are, you then pick the specific minis you want for that particular game.
Yeah, you hire a crew
Mm.
between rolling up the objectives and deploying.
Yeah. So you do, yes, write a list, but you write the list at the table, and it's reactive to the scenario that's been selected. Um, whereas
Bloody
then
good. It's
again,
really bloody good.
then the next jump up from that is obviously could be something like A Billion Suns,
Hmm.
which I think is still the sort of game that we are talking about, and it definitively has no list building of any kind at any point. Everybody has the exact same pool of miniatures of models, ships
Units.
available
Yeah.
at every point in the game, and you always jump them in reactively. Um, so definitely, I think that A Billion Suns is this sort of a game, and it definitely doesn't have any kind of list building. But generally, and like I say, for some people, definitively list building is sort of intrinsically linked to this kind of game, and it
I
is.
think one of the reasons that it can feel that way for sure is that like there's a physical preparation element here where like if I don't build a list, like I don't know what models to have constructed and possibly even painted and what's to make sure is in my tub of models when I roll up to the game.
Mm.
So
And I
there's like
think
a
like
there's like a practical reason for it as well.
yeah, and I think historically there's definitely a reason for it in that when a lot of us first encountered probably GW, games in our
Hmm.
youth, one of the weird things that is unlike all the other games you have played is this homework style pre-gaming solo gaming thing. And I'll certainly say, like, as a young child with not enough resources to buy every army that I wanted, and friends who would sometimes be playing a system that I wasn't interested in, a lot of the way that I interacted with some of the games that I wanted to play and couldn't persuade everybody else to play and couldn't afford an army for was by list building.
Hmm.
you know so I think, like, whatever it is, biographically, a lot of certainly games designers now have strong and fond memories of list building, and this is actually lovely because it's a solo sort of gaming thing. And it's like, I think a lot of these things, I think this is true for Magic the Gathering. The average Magic the Gathering player probably spends more time deck building than they do playing Magic the Gathering.
Hmm.
And arguably, and I think this would be the sort of, in relation to the taxonomy of what defines these games, if it is true that what a game is what what your players spend most of their time doing, then the average miniatures game is a list building game. You know, because the average player probably spends more time list building and list tinkering than they do physically playing your game.
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why my designs have ended up sliding off in the other direction is that um for whatever reason, over time, I've become substantially less interested in that homework thing. Like, I'm having more fun thinking about designing games and having fun painting models, such that, like, when I agree to play a game, I'm quite often like rapidly writing the list as we're getting the miniatures out because that's the totality of the like shits I give about the list
Oh,
writing process.
absolutely. And I remember, in my life, I've turned up to like mini tournaments. I certainly turned up to like club mini, tournaments, and people have rolled up, and the person's gone, okay, now we have to wait like 20 minutes while I write my list. And I'm like, dude, the round has started. We only barely have enough time to complete it. A run of the game. What do you mean you haven't written your list yet? No, I never write my list before I turn up to a pickup game. This isn't a pickup game. We've only got
Right.
like an hour and a half. And there are some people who like definitely are like everybody always writes their list once they have arrived to play, don't they? And it's like, yeah, but obviously, a lot of harsh feelings against some things like, Warhammer in its fantasy or sci-fi equivalent are you've lost before you turn up to the table.
Right. The sense that like the other person either built strong enough synergies that they've just got a better, more functioning machine than you, or that like, oh god, there's a thing in here that I don't have the tool to deal with, and so whether by design or luck they have put they put a rock and I've got absolutely no paper in my army.
Absolutely, and it's like I've definitely rolled up to games of Warhammer Fantasy Battle and looked at the two lists and gone, you cannot win, you
Hmm.
cannot beat me. This is definite. There's really very little point carrying out the. In fact, I remember.
The mechanical act of piloting this to its destruction.
Well, it's like I remember ages ago at a GW store, like playing somebody and having one of my only two perfect games of Warhammer where I tabled the person without taking a single wound. And at the end of it, the store owner was like, that's pathetic, that's horrifying that you should have lost so badly. I said to the store owner, you couldn't have beaten me with his list. It wasn't really about how he played. The store owner insisted he could. So I played the store owner and I tabled him as well. And it's like, no, that list cannot beat this list. It is not achievable. It is not to do with the decisions that you made during play. The best player in the world playing perfectly could not have won that game. Um, and yeah,
And like
obviously,
and so I think what's fine is that like if that's at the very extreme of like the curve that your game designer's created, like that Warhammer Fantasy Battle is about list building, and so there are places on the spectrum where you can have essentially a 0-1 outcome, but
mm.
they're like you've only had a couple of you I guess it it's a place on the spectrum, and therefore it's like a place that you can design to. I was going to say you probably only had a few games like that, but I guess there's probably a lot more places where like it's not completely perfect, but like it's a real uphill struggle. um
But I
and
think,
I think that what I find is that the counterbalance is that if you are the kind of gamer that hasn't chosen to invest or doesn't wish to or doesn't have the availability to invest in that homework, and what you thought you were signing up for was to have 90 minutes of fun pushing your miniatures around, and it turns out that actually you're going to have 90 miserable minutes of pushing your miniatures around because you didn't do 6 weeks of preparation, then that can rankle some players. And so for those players you need to give there's the opportunity to give them something different where you know like in A Billion Suns, like, no, we're just going to play 90 minutes of pushing spaceships around. There is no preparation possible. I mean, you can become more familiar with the game and so forth.
well, sorry,
No, that's it.
what I think, personally, I think a lot of this is about like clarity of intent for your players, and I think the
Mm.
reason that particularly
And
GW
like
games,
selling them in on that.
yeah, I think particularly the reason that GW games like suffer from it more or have people reporting suffering from it more than other games is that GW games have the broadest possible church of players.
Right.
You know, and I remember having a conversation once again, with another competitive Warhammer Fantasy Battle player, and they were saying that the problem with like casual or sort of fluff based players, he was saying, is they make up rules that don't exist within the game, don't tell anybody else about them, and then get upset by when other people don't play by those rules.
Mm-hmm.
That like nobody takes two steam tanks. You're clearly allowed to take two steam tanks. Yeah, but you shouldn't. And when you have a game as broad, an audience as broad as say Warhammer does, the two people meet up, and one of them's going like, no, but you're meant to build a game by build a list that includes story, and well, that faction would never stand shoulder to shoulder with that faction. The other person's going, how, how did I know that? Nothing
Yeah,
in the rules.
what specific technical rule set
Yeah,
states that I can't put X and Y together?
yeah, I
If you
wasn't
don't think
aware of.
X and Y are friends, fine, but
Yeah, I wasn't aware of those things. There are some rules in this that says, oh, these people have uneasy alliances and suffer penalties for it, and these guys don't happen to. But, you tell me that, and you get these sort of these people who are playing slightly different types of games, all mashed together in a single game, and that's where you sort of get friction and sparks fly. And it's interesting to me personally sometimes seeing some Warhammer commentators reacting to an influx of new players who basically roll. Some of them are rolling in, looking at the rules, and then playing to the rules. And some older commentators being like, "Well, this is ruining the game." These people who aren't aware of this wealth of history that says that you shouldn't be putting him with him and him with him. And these other people are just like, it's just a
well,
set
that
of
yeah,
rules.
that I suppose is about the nebulous spirit of the game, which is
Absolutely. And so for
so it
me,
could be valuable, could be a gatekeeping thing.
yeah, for me, being very clear on the intent of the game and the spirit of the game, for your players is hopefully one of the ways that you sort of ameliorate the tendency to lose the game before turning up at the table, is by ensuring that both people sort of understand, you know, where they should be meeting. Because it's GW, I say does, used to probably 10 or 12 years ago, ran a narrative um, tournament. Like it was an official one. It wasn't hugely publicized, but it's where you turned up and your lists had to have full stories and and everyone sort of judged your list within composition levels and whether it made sense, the fluff and the background, and it all came together. So it's entirely achievable even within a game like Warhammer Fantasy Battle by a company like GW to go, okay guys, this tournament here is for just kicking each other's teeth in with the rule set as a weapon. This tournament here, we're going to do something different, and there are these other conditionals, and everybody rolls up knowing what the buy-in is and playing in a different way and in a different fashion. And lots of games have tournaments have things like composition scores, and ways in which you can say, no, it's not okay taking. I know it's technically okay to do that, but it's not okay to do that. And it's like Magic the Gathering has a certain level of this in its multiple different play versions and ways of going okay, you're only allowed to take from this block and from that block and from this block and that block.
Well,
And
I
so,
mean, at its very core, I find it super interesting that there is a way to play without list building in Magic, and it's called drafting, and it's
yeah,
an exciting at the table social experience. Um, we've talked a few times about, is there a drafting? Is there some way of gamifying the construction of lists at the table, beyond the experiment in A Billion Suns? But
and this is one of the reasons that it breaks my heart on a semi-regular basis that Pirates of the Spanish Main had such a sucky rule set to it, because there's a game where you could literally have drafted minis at the tabletop. Because the reason that you can't draft an army at the tabletop is because you've got to assemble and paint a crap ton of minis. And the fact that there was this sort of concept for a minis game where you could crack a booster pack and have some minis spill out of it and go okay, well, let's draft our forces, was
Hot
brilliant.
for the win. Yeah.
And I mean, conceivably, if you're going to do a papercraft minis game of some kind, you could still achieve that. I think the one of the ways that I think that some people try to break the "you've lost before you arrive at the table," and I think there's something to talk about, is by balancing everything in the game so perfectly that basically, well, whatever you choose, it's going to be good because everything is balanced with everything else to within an inch of its life. Um, Personally, I think at that point, what you've achieved is removing the choice process of list building. It's like if it is literally true that I could throw a dart at the arm, at the units and turn up with a perfectly good army, then making me pick units is kind of a chore, unless that like
Maybe, I guess, unless you have achieved the higher goal of like this army can win if you play it in the right way. Like if you play X in the way you're supposed to play Y, you won't win. But like X can always win, Y can always win, but you have to do the thing that they do. Except when you're both playing your perfect X and Y game, in which case I don't know what happens then.
and of course this in turn will lead into maybe another conversation about the issue with mastery. if
And it always does, yeah.
if the way in which your game like works and balances is when everybody plays correctly, then your game doesn't work if people don't know how to play your game yet, and you've then got other sort of
So
problems.
do you feel like balance, internal balance inside the game is like a phantom created by this problem that quite is a phantom that people chase in order to solve the problem of like, well, some things are just some things are better, so if you build the right list or you build the wrong list, then you just auto win slash auto lose.
I think like there's a really interesting YouTube video about Magic the Gathering. I can't remember its exact title, but it's something like yeah, in praise of One with Nothing. There's a Magic the Gathering card called One with Nothing that is irrefutably terrible.
Mm.
It basically you discard your entire hand, and it's like it's just bad. There's much better ways of doing any of the things that could be achieved with that card. It always puts you at a massive disadvantage. And there is a certain sort of player who is eternally seeking the
Mm.
deck that makes One with Nothing brilliant.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that balancing list building to a degree is not servicing that sort of player. Um,
Yeah, so it's not servicing the actual act of list building, which
mm,
is the curiosity, the exploration, the experimentation, the fact that there are better and worse options out there to discover, and therefore it's worth exploring.
yeah, there is a sort of a joy to figuring out what is right and what is wrong within the list. And there is an argument to say that a choice that is plainly, manifestly, and visible to anybody who looks at it a bad choice is the way that you teach a player that there are bad choices.
Right.
The video games will do this all the time. Video games will just have a thing where you do the wrong thing and you just get your head blown off and you go, oh, right, that's why I
Don't
don't
step
do
into
that.
that puddle of green liquid.
Yeah, and they'll just smack you across the chops with it early on, and it's a learning moment. You don't lose too much progress, and that's great. In list building with minis games, if there is a manifestly in list building with minis games, if there is a subtle, not like instantly obvious, completely terrible choice, the first time that you find out that what you have done was a terrible idea is when you have spent several £100 and multiple hours putting together an entire force and then just getting mashed into the ground by an average player with an average arm, and you go, oh, bloody,
Yeah.
various expletives. If you open the book up and you look at it and you go, just a minute, that thing is terrible. There are terrible things in these lists. I would have to be a moron to choose that thing. I will look at each thing assuming that there's a possibility that only a moron will choose that thing. it's a way of getting people to figure out that there are like bad choices prior to spending a couple £100 on a bad choice.
Mm.
Whether it, you don't want to do it a lot, and whether it's completely effective for all players, but I personally think that there is a good argument for putting some visibly boneheaded things into sort of any given list building system. And I think that one of the lovely sort of side effects to it is that there's some obsessive weirdo out there who's going to turn that into a really powerful army by sort of putting together a collection of like weird kajanky peculiarities that then turn out to obliterate everything with the thing that you were absolutely certain was a boneheaded choice. Um, but yeah, I mean, I
I,
think
I guess this is something that I'm not certain I know, but like, is there something here around the like granularity of list building where, like, if I want to make a less list building heavy game or a more list building heavy game, like, is the granularity of the options and the sort of fiddliness of what I can add and subtract, does that add to the list buildinginess because there's more places you can make mistakes or the mistakes can be more graduated?
yeah, and I definitely think that one of the issues with this as a cursed problem is that there's this sort of the GW shaped list building, which has quite a lot of granularity. You can have quite a lot of detail in most games. You can go into like where that guy's got grenades and that guy doesn't, and that guy's got a las cannon and that guy's got a storm bolter and whatever the hell else it is. And you can do quite a lot of tinkering because they are inherently list building games more than they are tabletop miniatures games. And we assume that if you're going to have list building, you should have quite a lot of granularity. I should be able to pick exactly how many people are in my squad. But I think there's a strong argument for saying like there's nothing wrong with going like, okay, what you do is you pick your general and you pick a faction and then you pick like a sub faction, and those three choices are gonna like pump out whatever 20 units or something, because that general always has these dudes and that faction always has these dudes and that sub faction always has these dudes, and you can chunk list building in such a way that people can go like, well, my force is quite unique, um like it plays the way I want it to play, because these I think are the ideals of list building. It's a form of expression,
Yeah.
and it's like you get to play the game that you enjoy, that with an army that works the way you want it to work, and you get to show a little bit of flair in how you sort of picked your guys out and the story you've
Mm.
built. The dark side of it is building a game that isn't a tabletop game, it's a list building game. And I
Yeah.
think one of the good ways of getting around, sort of personally of getting around it, is by sort of chunking list building. And it's like it's been sort of,
Right, which is basically saying like extract a lot of granularity.
yeah, fundamentally, I do think like, and the reason I think it's a good thing is like, as I said a few times, these curse problems are a lot of the time on like, you know ends of axes, and
Mm.
granularity, like as the name suggests, is an axis that you can like, it's a slider, you can push up one way or the other.
So listening to you talk about that actually makes me think quite a lot about how 10th edition 40k has moved. I'm not familiar with ninth or 8th, so I'm not certain about those, but like in 10th, like you can't really, you only buy guys in like blocks of 5, or and then you have to buy another 5, and the points increase when you get to that next 10.
Hmm.
You don't choose any war gear, like you just pick which of the options they've got. And so like lots of people were screaming, well, if you take away the prices of war gear, then like some of the options are just bad and you'll never take them. And again, like that wouldn't matter unless the Volkite rifle guns were like good in the last edition, and now you've got a load of guys with the wrong gun. Um, and there aren't really any magic items. You just like your general gets like one magic item, and you get like one faction ability, and blah blah blah. And so they, I think, have with their like with their command point resources, and this less granular list building. I think a lot of that is sort of pushing it in the direction of like, no, 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 no. As a design goal, we want the game to be played at the table. There is
Mhm.
still a lot of list building in there. It's just that you've got slightly more Duplo-sized blocks to fit together. It's like I've got an orc army, like I can only fit it together a few different ways. It's not like I can like fiddle around with like, does this snotling have a hand grenade? And if he doesn't, then the mech can have another pair of shoes.
Yeah, and it's interesting sometimes because like the default assumption of any big change that GW makes is that it is, and it might well be, in order to profit more off of selling people plastic.
Yeah,
And so when you make a decision to go like, okay, you have to buy things in blocks of like 5 or 10 or whatever, somebody goes, all right, so you're gonna make me buy Space Marines in boxes of 5 or 10 rather than like just having like one or two or whatever. And look, I'm not saying that I definitively know that that wasn't a motivation behind it.
well, also they haven't sold Space Marines in blister packs for like 30 years.
Well, yeah, sure.
Well,
But
20.
like fundamentally, there is a reasonable like dealing with the problems that a fan base complain about, i.e., I've lost before I get to the table, by making that decision to move granularity to something more chunky. So it's like I would guess that that would be a design decision behind it if there was a person who made a design decision behind that choice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no,
Um,
I think it is that I think it's fairly intentional. But I think that's like, and then like Hobgoblin sort of is in a similar space, but a little bit further along on the axis of like, I want people to, I want people to feel relaxed that they should do a little bit of list building, but there's only so much like shitting the bed that you can do in the list building part of that game.
yeah, I mean, Hobgoblin is very balanced. Like the choices are very balanced. It's very hard to like gain an enormous amount of advantage before you come to the tabletop, and it's not super granular. You
Yeah.
get a unit. It's got like it's 10. It's courage of 10. It's 10 doom. However you want to put it, and you can't put another dude in there so that it has like an additional wound. It doesn't get a certain number of ranks depending on like how many people are in there. You can't give it a banner or take a banner away. There is like is quite block in its sort of choices. And
Mm.
yeah, that is absolutely because that was central to your sort of design ethos, that it was like this is a game that you can write a list because you think the things are cool and you want to play a certain way with very little fear that that's going to wreck your chances, and then you can win or lose the game at the tabletop rather than long before you ever saw the other guy.
And I think that's kind of intriguing as well as like list building in Magic the Gathering is one thing. List building, as you said, when I have to acquire, build, and paint the miniatures is quite a different thing. And so I think that when thinking about like, is my game going to be a list building game or a tactical at the table game, you're also implicitly making a decision about how reversible, how significant my hobby decisions are. And I
Mm.
find that I think some people find that quite enjoyable. Like they'll get a box of Space Marines and they'll get the sprues out and they'll start assembling them and they'll get to like the weapon option and they'll be like, oh no, now I'm going to go on Reddit and find out whether the auto gun or the like blast cannon is the better option, and what which should I give them, the hammers or the spears? Like I don't know. And so like engaging in list building as part of building a plastic kit, I think is some people's jam. Whereas I'm like, well, these hammers look weird and floppy. Like the spears look great. Let's go with the spears. And then to discover that like that was the jank choice and I was an idiot for like your moment where you read the list and go, well, only an idiot would choose that. Like that's me reading the list having already built the miniatures because that's the cooler looking weapon option.
Yeah, and
That's the idiot that takes the spears.
and there is a virtue to like knowing about the irreversibility of your decisions, in that like I have to sit down and study this book and I have to in my head figure out the definitively better choice, because once I have made that choice I'm going to have to make a financial commitment to putting it in place. Is to a
Or
certain sort of
magnetize.
person, sorry, is to a certain sort of person like brilliant. I have to really sit down and really think about my
Right.
list
There's a
building.
consequence to
It
this decision.
matters. It's important. It matters not just because I'm going to win, because it's going to cost me actual money.
Yeah.
This I really have to solve this puzzle. Ooh,
Right.
ooh, and it's like where your players are, where your game is, who you want your players to be, how you want them to react to the choices you're giving them are all again the things that are going to define your game. You can't have a game where list building really matters, like on one pole, and you always win or lose the game at the table, on their extremes. You're going to find somewhere in the middle. Clearly communicating where you are on the spectrum, you know, knowing the sort of player type those choices are going to appeal to, and appealing to those player types well, and knowing the sorts of things that trigger their happiness, and making sure that you service those things within those players, I think are more important than which of the choices you make. It doesn't really matter where on the spectrum you are, so long as that when you pick it.
Right. Well, there are players of both games available, and therefore customers for the game that you might want to write in both directions. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's certainly at the level of, like, customer base that we're, people who I imagine are watching this channel are trying to appeal to. There are plenty of customers for your game out there, whichever niche you pick. What is important is that when you pick a niche, you go, okay, right, this one is going to appeal to this sort of person. This sort of person wants to be punished when they make a bad choice, frankly. It's that games like Elden Ring have proven that being mean to your players does not make a bad game or an unsuccessful one.
Mhm.
There are certain players who react to, being smacked in the face when they make a bad choice, and there are certain players who don't. Know who your player is, know what your game is, know
Teach
how
it to them.
to appeal to players with your game.
Mm.
That's the important thing, not which choices you make, but understanding the meaning of those choices, and how to fit them together, and how to build an appealing game to the people who are going to play it.
Mm.
And with that,
Do we break the curse?
well, it's the thing. It's like it's still, you can't have everything. It's
Yeah.
just
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
Sorry, that was slightly a joke about Sean Sutter's new Curse Breaker game as well, I guess.
right, and a very
Um,
splendid game it is too. But yeah, these things are about, paying your money and taking a choice, and understanding the meaning of your choices, and how to appeal to people with them.
it's
Not
almost
about
like
trying to
games
have
design
everything.
itself as a game.
Indeed, it often is.
Do you like the meaningful choices? All right.
Right. Okay. Get yourself down into the comment section and tell us your feelings about list building. Are they definitive of these sorts of games? Do you prefer a game to have a lot of pre-list building? Do you love getting lost in the reeds of the minutiae of building yourself a list? Have you ever been stung by buying a huge miniature or a expensive entire army
Then we
and
all
think
have. We all have.
and thinking, oh,
Some of
this is
us are just more deeply scarred by it.
and thinking that it's going to absolutely crush all who come before it, and then get it to the tabletop and get spanked like a naughty school child.
In fact, I keep the book here as a talisman.
I've got the entire series of those books.
Did you buy all the monster miniatures for it?
Oh no, God no, they were all completely awful.
Good looking kits though, fun to paint.
Yeah. What was the thing you thought was brilliant that you bought a very expensive miniature for, and then learned that it was complete jank on the tabletop? Tell us these things and more. Hit on the like and subscribe buttons. Run yourself across to our Patreons and support us for doing this, and our websites, and buy things from us to support us for doing this. And sling yourself over to the Discord, where there are many people who have terrible stories about having been um, ganked for enormous amounts of money for miniatures that are a load of garbage. But for now, I think from this episode, This Root of Carnage, it's going to be a thank you and goodbye. So, thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye, 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 bye.